Racist clerk refuses service to girl, shocked to learn her dad's status. What happens when a simple act of ignorance and prejudice turns into a life-changing moment? Imagine being judged unfairly by someone who doesn't even know you, only to have that very person realize that you're far more important than they could ever imagine. This is the story of a young girl who faced racial discrimination in a way that shocked everyone around her. But what happens when the person who wronged her discovers that her father is someone they could never have imagined? Keep reading, because this is a story of karma, redemption, and the hidden truths people often fail to see. It was a typical busy afternoon at the local grocery store in a bustling, middle-class neighborhood. People moved quickly through the aisles, their shopping carts clattering as they filled them with essentials. The bright fluorescent lights hummed above, illuminating the rows of neatly stocked shelves. In one corner of the store, a young girl stood alone by the checkout counter, nervously clutching a basket filled with a few items: milk, bread, and some fruits. Her name was Maria, and though she was only 16 years old, she had grown up quickly. She had learned to navigate the world with a sense of resilience beyond her years, due in part to her upbringing in a family that had faced prejudice and challenges that most people couldn't imagine. Maria was an African-American girl, her hair braided neatly, and her eyes sharp with intelligence. She had a quiet, dignified air about her, one that came from years of being overlooked by society simply because of the color of her skin. As she stood there, her thoughts were interrupted by the clerk behind the register. His name was Carl, a man in his mid-30s, with a sharp glare and an attitude that seemed to reflect the rough edges of his personality. He was known around the store for his sarcastic remarks and gruff demeanor, but Maria had never experienced anything more than a polite indifference from him in the past. That day, however, something would change. "That all?" Carl asked in a tone that was almost dismissive, not even looking at her directly. Maria nodded, a bit taken aback by his abruptness but trying to keep calm. She wasn't the type to cause trouble, and she just wanted to get her items and go home. However, Carl's next words would leave her stunned. "Cash only," he muttered, pointing to the sign near the counter. Maria's eyes went wide. She hadn't seen that notice before. She looked down at the small amount of change she had in her pocket, knowing it wasn't enough to cover the total. She hesitated for a moment, trying to count the change quickly in her head, but Carl wasn't having any of it. His tone sharpened. "Come on, hurry up, I don't have all day." Maria felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She tried to explain. "I don't have enough cash, I can come back later with the rest." Carl's expression hardened. He looked her up and down with disdain, almost as if he was disgusted by her presence. "Figures," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear. "Just another one of you people always trying to get something for nothing." Maria felt the sting of his words. Her heart sank. She had encountered discrimination before, but this was different. It was cold, deliberate, and cruel. Without thinking, she reached for her phone, hoping to call her father for some help. But before she could do so, Carl snapped at her again. "Don't bother," he sneered. "I don't think anyone's going to want to help you." It was clear to Maria that Carl wasn't just upset about the money. His behavior was fueled by something deeper, something ugly. He had made up his mind about her based on her appearance alone, without taking a moment to consider who she really was. She was about to leave, tears welling up in her eyes, when suddenly, the store's door opened with a jingle. The air in the room shifted as a man entered, tall, well-dressed, and with an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. Maria didn't recognize him at first, but Carl seemed to stiffen as the man walked toward the counter. The man's voice was calm and authoritative as he approached. "Is there a problem here, Carl?" Carl immediately stood straighter, his demeanor shifting from arrogance to something resembling fear. No, sir. Just a small issue with the girl's payment. She doesn't have enough cash." Maria looked up, wiping her eyes quickly. The man turned to her, offering a kind smile. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Maria nodded, not knowing what to say, still shaken from the earlier confrontation. The man turned to Carl again, his voice now more serious. I don't think you're treating this young lady with the respect she deserves. She's a customer, just like anyone else here." Carl's face turned red. "I'm just doing my job, sir. She was trying to pay with a credit card and I told her it was cash only." The man's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not the problem here, Carl. I'm more concerned about the way you spoke to her." His words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and Carl faltered under the scrutiny. Maria felt a strange sense of comfort in the man's presence. There was something about him, something that made her feel protected, like he genuinely cared about what had just happened. She watched as Carl began to stutter, unable to form a coherent response. The man stepped forward, glancing at the items Maria had placed on the counter. "I'll cover her purchase," he said, pulling out his wallet. But just as he did, Maria spoke up. "No, it's okay. I'll come back later when I can pay the full amount." The man smiled kindly at her. "Don't worry about it. I've got it covered. And if anyone else treats you this way, you let me know." Carl, still visibly flustered, fumbled with the register keys, trying to finish the transaction as quickly as possible. Maria took the bag from the counter, feeling both grateful and confused by the man's kindness. But as she turned to leave, Carl's voice rang out again, this time with a sarcastic edge. "Maybe next time don't come in here looking like that, huh?" His words were quiet, but Maria could hear them clearly. She stopped in her tracks, her body stiffening with anger. Just as she was about to say something in return, the man behind the counter placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't mind him," he said, his voice steady. "Some people can't see past their own ignorance." Maria nodded, swallowing her anger as she headed toward the door. The man followed her for a moment before turning back to Carl, who was still trying to regain his composure. The man leaned in, his voice low and firm. "Let me make something clear, Carl. If you ever treat another person like that again, I'll make sure your little job here won't last long. Do I make myself clear?" Carl nodded, his face pale. "Yes, sir, crystal clear." As Maria stepped out of the store, she looked up at the man, still not understanding who he was or why he had been so kind. But then he smiled at her, the kindness in his eyes unmistakable. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that young lady," he said, extending his hand. "My name is David Brooks. I'm the CEO of this company. That man behind the counter is a reflection of a problem we've been trying to address for a long time. People like him don't belong here." Maria blinked, stunned. She had no idea who David Brooks was, but his words meant everything to her. "Thank you," she said quietly, finally finding her voice. It wasn't until later that night, when Maria shared the encounter with her mother, that she learned just how significant David Brooks's actions had been. Not only was he a successful businessman, but he was also known for his philanthropic efforts to combat racism and inequality in the community. He had used his wealth and influence to create programs aimed at helping disadvantaged groups, especially those affected by systemic discrimination. David's intervention had not only saved her from an embarrassing situation, but had also been an example of what it truly meant to stand up against injustice. Maria realized that in that moment, he had seen her not as a problem or a stereotype, but as a human being worthy of dignity and respect. The next day, Carl was fired. Maria never returned to that grocery store, and though she had no way of knowing, David had made sure that Carl's future employment would reflect his treatment of others. He had learned a powerful lesson in empathy and kindness, one that would remain with him for the rest of his life. As for Maria, she continued with her life, her spirit unbroken. She was stronger now, empowered by the knowledge that there were people out there who would stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. This story reminds us that a single act of kindness can change someone's life. It also teaches us the importance of standing up against prejudice and discrimination. No matter how small the act, standing up for others, especially when they are most vulnerable, can ripple through a community and bring about change. Always remember that who we are on the inside is what truly matters. And sometimes, The most remarkable individuals are the ones we least expect.